The first night I heard my own front door open, I was standing in my slippers with a cup of chamomile, listening to the little click that used to mean safety. Then I heard a man's voice I didn't recognize say, "We'll take the bigger bedroom." And my daughter's laugh followed like she'd already signed the papers to my life. I'm 67 years old. I've paid this condo off twice in my head, once with money and once with worry. The building sits on the edge of Lake Michigan. Not fancy, just tidy, with beige carpet in the hallways and a lobby that smells faintly of lemon polish and winter coats. I know the rhythm of it. The elevator groans at 7:10 a.m. The mail slot clanks at noon. Mrs. Delaney's little dog yaps at anyone who looks like they might be carrying groceries. I've lived here long enough that the doorman, Javier, doesn't ask my name. He just says, "Morning, Ms. Whittaker," and holds the door like kindness is a habit. Frank used to do that for me too. My husband, Frank Whittaker, died 8 years ago on a Tuesday. It was the kind of Tuesday where the sky can't decide if it's going to snow or just threaten you with it. He'd been sitting in his recliner, the one with the worn armrest where his thumb always rested, and I was folding a towel when I noticed the room had gone too quiet. The ambulance came fast, but life doesn't always care about fast. After the funeral, after the casseroles stopped coming, after people stopped calling just to check in, I learned what loneliness really sounds like. It sounds like a refrigerator motor at 2 a.m. It sounds like your own breathing when you wake up from a dream and reach for a hand that isn't there. I didn't have a big retirement. Frank was a union electrician, steady work, steady pride. I was a receptionist for most of my adult life, the kind who learned everyone's coffee order and typed thank you letters on time. We saved, we clipped coupons, we didn't gamble with what we couldn't replace. When Frank passed, I sold the house in Oak Lawn and bought this 2-bedroom condo because it felt manageable. No yard, no stairs, a little balcony where I could keep my geraniums and talk to the lake like it was an old friend. And then there was Susan. My daughter has always been the kind of pretty that makes strangers want to help her. She's 42 now, but she still tosses her hair the way she did at 17, like the world is watching, and she's giving it something to look at. We had our hard years, the ones I don't like to hold up to the light. Frank and Susan clashed like weather fronts, his rules, her storms. When she got married to a man named Kevin, I cried in the church bathroom, not because I was unhappy, but because I felt the ground shifting under my feet. Children grow, they leave, and you're supposed to clap and smile while your heart rearranges itself. Over the years, Susan came in waves. Sometimes she'd call every day. Sometimes I wouldn't hear from her for months. She always had a reason, always had a new job, a new plan, a new basis that needed a soft place to land. I tried not to keep score. Mothers who keep score end up bitter, and bitterness is a flavor that ruins everything. Still, I noticed details. The last year, my phone would light up with her name when my own bills were due. "Mom, can you spot me until Friday?" she'd say, and I'd look at my bank app and calculate what spot really meant. I'd mail checks because online payments made my eyes tired, and sometimes I'd forget and send a little extra, the way you do when you're trying to prove you're still useful. She'd promise to pay me back and then send me a heart emoji like affection could balance a ledger. When the building started charging more for parking, I cut back on little luxuries. I switched to the generic tea. I stopped buying the good butter. I told myself it was normal inflation, normal aging, normal sacrifice. But the truth is, every time Susan needed something, I made my life smaller to make room for her. That night, the night, I had been expecting her, sort of. She'd texted earlier. "Stopping by, need to talk." No time. No question, just a statement that sat on my screen like a weight. I straightened the throw pillows and set out the good cookies Frank liked, the ones with the thin layer of chocolate that snaps when you bite it. I even put on mascara, which at my age feels like painting a fence in a storm, but I wanted to look like someone worth listening to. At 8:47 p.m., I heard keys, not knocking, not buzzing up from the lobby. Keys. My stomach did something slow and cold. I walked to the entryway, and before I could even reach the door, it swung open wide like I was a guest in my own home. Susan came in first, carrying a tote bag with a designer logo. Behind her was a man in a puffer jacket, lugging 2 suitcases that scraped against my hardwood floor. He didn't look at me when he crossed the threshold. He looked down the hallway as if measuring. "Mom," Susan said brightly, cheeks flushed from the cold. "Okay, so this is Darren." Darren held up a hand in a half wave, already moving toward the second bedroom. My second bedroom, the one I used as a sewing room and a quiet place to read when the lake wind made the windows rattle. "And this," Susan continued, like she was giving a tour, "is going to work perfectly." "Work for what?" I asked, though I already felt the answer pressing against my ribs. She smiled in that practiced way, the one that makes you feel like you're being unreasonable before you've even spoken. "For us, we're staying here for a while." I heard myself say, "A while?" like my mouth didn't recognize the word. Darren called from the hallway, "Babe, where do you want the big suitcase?" Susan didn't even turn her head. "Put it in the master," she said, casual as breath. Then she looked back at me, softening her voice the way you soften your tone with a child. "Mom, you can use the basement room. It's fine. I saw it online. Someone in the building listed theirs. It has space." I blinked. "The basement room?" "Our building has storage units in the basement, little cages of chain link and padlocks. There's also a maintenance office, a laundry room with humming fluorescent lights, and a guest suite residents can rent for a fee." I'd stayed in it once when my bathroom was being renovated. It was clean, but it wasn't a home. It smelled like bleach and someone else's soap. "You mean the guest suite?" I said, my voice thinner than I expected. Susan walked past me like she hadn't heard the question. She set her tote bag on my kitchen counter, my counter, right beside the folder where I kept my condo association statements and utility bills. My January gas bill was sticking out. So was the reminder about the annual building meeting. My life, in neat paper stacks. Her bag landed on it all like punctuation. "Mom, listen," she said, opening my fridge. "Don't freak out. We just need stability for a bit. And you're so good at, you know, making things calm." I stared at her hand on the milk carton I'd bought that morning. I stared at the magnet on the fridge with Frank's handwriting still on it. "Call plumber." He'd written it years ago and I never replaced it because it felt like keeping a piece of him in the room. "How did you get a key?" I finally asked. Susan's eyes flicked away for a fraction of a second. "Oh, I had one made. You left your spare at my place last year. Remember?" I did remember. I remembered handing her a spare when she said she was worried about me living alone, when she said it was just in case. I remembered the relief in her voice when she held it, like it was proof that she still had a claim. "You didn't ask," I said, and my own words sounded strange, like I was hearing myself from across the room. Susan sighed and leaned against the counter, tapping her phone as if this were all being logged somewhere for later. "Mom, don't make it a thing. It's family. You always say family helps family." That phrase hit me right in the tender spot where guilt likes to live. I had said it. I had meant it. But I had never meant it like this. Behind her, Darren's suitcase wheels clicked across my floor again. I heard a closet door slide open in the master bedroom. I heard my hangers clink, like someone touching my history without permission. The condo felt smaller by the minute. The air felt different too, crowded, claimed. And in the middle of it, Susan looked at me the way people look at furniture: useful, familiar, and easy to move if it's in the way. I wanted to shout. I wanted to cry. Instead, I did what women of my generation were trained to do when the world pushes too hard. I swallowed it. I nodded once, like I was agreeing to something reasonable, like I was still the calm center of the storm. Then I turned to the folder on the counter, slid my association statements back into alignment, and felt my fingers pause over the paper as if they were trying to tell me something my heart hadn't said out loud yet. Because in that moment, standing in my own kitchen while my daughter claimed my bedroom and offered me the basement like a consolation prize, I realized something that made the room tilt. Susan didn't move in because she needed me. She moved in because she believed I wouldn't stop her. By morning, my home no longer sounded like mine. The coffee maker hissed too early, drawers closed with unfamiliar force, and a man I barely knew cleared his throat in the hallway like he owned the echo. I lay awake in my bed, staring at the faint crack in the ceiling Frank and I used to joke looked like Florida, listening to Susan laugh at something on her phone while Darren showered in my bathroom. My bathroom. The one with the leaky faucet I'd learned to ignore because repairs cost money and patience. When I finally stepped into the kitchen, Susan was already there, barefoot, scrolling through emails on her phone while sipping from my favorite mug, the blue one with the chip on the rim. Frank had dropped it once and apologized to the mug like it could hear him. Seeing it in her hand made my chest tighten in a quiet, embarrassed way. "Morning, Mom," she said, cheerful, like nothing unusual had happened. "We're going to run some errands later. Oh, and Darren works from home, so he'll need the second bedroom set up as an office. We'll move your stuff." She said it so easily. "We'll move your stuff," as if my life were a few boxes in the way of better lighting. I poured myself coffee and noticed the level in the bag was lower than it should have been. Darren glanced up from the table, laptop already open, my dining table now dotted with cables and a legal pad. He nodded at me politely, the way men do when they don't expect a response. "I hope that's okay," Susan added, not waiting for an answer. "You don't really use that room anyway." I wanted to tell her about the quilt half finished on the sewing table, about the letters from Frank I kept in the bottom drawer, about how that room was where I went when the nights got too loud with memory. Instead, I took my mug and sat down slowly, careful with my knees. "It's temporary," she said, softer now, like she was offering comfort. "Just until we get back on our feet." I nodded again. I'd perfected that nod over decades. The nod that says I hear you, when what it really means is I don't recognize myself right now. Days blurred into each other after that. My routine disappeared quietly, like something stolen without breaking a window. Susan used my address for deliveries. Boxes came daily, stacked by the door until I had to step sideways to pass. Darren took conference calls in the living room when the bedroom got too warm. I stopped watching my afternoon shows because his voice carried through the walls, full of confidence and jargon. Bills started changing. The electric statement arrived first, thicker than usual. I opened it at the kitchen counter, hands slightly unsteady, and stared at the number like it might explain itself. Then came the water bill. Then the internet upgrade Susan ordered because the old speed was impossible. She promised to split costs, said she'd Venmo me. She said it with a kiss on my cheek, already halfway out the door. The payments never came. I kept every envelope. I stacked them neatly in the folder that used to hold only predictable numbers. I didn't say anything when Susan borrowed my car and returned it with the gas light on. I didn't say anything when Darren installed a smart lock on the front door for security and handed me a new code written on a scrap of paper. I told myself this was what mothers did. We absorbed inconvenience like it was part of the job description. Still, something inside me grew quiet and watchful. One afternoon, I overheard Susan on the balcony, her voice low but sharp. She's fine, she said into the phone. Toy, she doesn't need much. Honestly, she'd be lost without us. The words settled into me like sediment. That night, I went down to the basement laundry room to escape the noise upstairs. The machines hummed steadily, a sound I'd always found comforting. As I waited for my clothes, I noticed the bulletin board by the elevator. Someone had posted a notice about unauthorized occupancy, bold letters underlined twice. Condo association rules, maximum residents per unit, guest limits, fines. I stood there longer than necessary, rereading it, feeling something shift from hurt into clarity. Back upstairs, I locked my bedroom door for the first time since Frank died. The click was small, but it echoed in my chest. I sat on the edge of the bed, surrounded by the quiet I'd been surrendering piece by piece, and let myself feel the truth I'd been avoiding. I wasn't being helped. I was being managed. And for the first time since Susan walked in with those suitcases, I didn't fall asleep wondering how to keep the peace. I fell asleep thinking about boundaries, about paper trails, about how many years I had left, and how many of them I was willing to give away just to avoid conflict. In the dark, with the lake wind pressing against the windows, I rested my hand on the nightstand where Frank's old watch still lay, unmoving, but solid. I didn't know exactly what I would do yet, but I knew I would not disappear quietly. The first time Susan called me dramatic, it was over a grocery receipt. I'd come home with 2 paper bags from Mariano's, my fingers sore from the cold, and found them both in the kitchen eating my chicken salad straight from the deli container. Darren had his feet on a chair like he was in a waiting room. Susan didn't even look up when I set the receipt beside the sink. $68? I said, trying to keep my voice light. That can't be right for a few basics. Susan finally glanced at the paper, then at me, and laughed once, short and dismissive. Mom, prices are insane. Don't start. I'm not starting, I said. I'm just noticing. That was enough for her to roll her eyes. You always do this. You act like we're ruining you. It's dramatic. I stood there with my coat still on, smelling like wind and bus exhaust, and felt something sting behind my eyes, not because of the word, but because of how easily she used it. Dramatic, like my concern was theater, like my money was imaginary. Later that week, I discovered the first real trick. A thick envelope arrived from the bank, the kind that makes your heart speed up before you even open it. Inside was a notice about unusual activity and a temporary hold placed on my debit card. I sat at my kitchen table, the one now crowded with Darren's cables, and called the number printed at the top. I listened to the automated voice repeat itself twice before a young man finally answered, sounding like he'd been awake too long. He confirmed my name, my address, and then said, "Ma'am, someone attempted to change your online banking credentials yesterday. They had your full name, date of birth, and the last 4 of your social." My mouth went dry. "Change them how?" "Password reset," he said. "Also an attempt to add a secondary phone number for verification." I stared at my landline on the wall, the one I still used because it felt dependable. "What number?" He read it out, and it was Susan's. I hung up after securing the account and setting up additional verification, my hands trembling as I wrote down the new passphrase on a piece of paper I immediately tore up. I walked into the living room where Susan was sorting, my mail into piles like she was the gatekeeper of my life. "Susan," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "Why is your phone number on my bank account?" She blinked, then lifted her chin the way she used to when she got caught sneaking out in high school. "I didn't do anything. They probably asked for a backup number and I gave mine. It's easier. You forget things, Mom." "I don't forget," I said quietly. She exhaled like I was exhausting. Okay, fine. I was just trying to help. You should be grateful someone's looking out for you. Grateful. That word, too, landed hard. Darren didn't look up from his laptop. He just kept typing, the keys clicking like rain. I went to my bedroom and closed the door. My reflection in the mirror looked older than it had a month ago. Not in the face exactly, but in the posture. I sat on the edge of the bed and thought about how many times I'd heard people say elders get confused. Elders misplace things. Elders need supervision. It's a convenient story. It makes it easy to take control and call it care. Have you ever felt your own life being rewritten right in front of you, with you still standing there? The next twist came through the Condo Association. In my mailbox, tucked between catalogs and a flyer for carpet cleaning, was a form titled Resident Update. Someone had filled it out in neat handwriting, listing Susan and Darren as occupants. Under emergency contact, Susan's name appeared again. Under preferred communication, there was an email address I didn't recognize. The signature at the bottom was supposed to be mine. It wasn't. My stomach turned with a slow certainty. Susan hadn't just moved in. She was planting flags. That afternoon, I went down to the lobby holding the form like evidence. Javier looked up from his desk and gave me a sympathetic smile. The kind people give when they sense trouble but don't want to ask. "Everything okay, Ms. Whitaker?" he said. "I need to speak with the property manager," I told him. He pointed me toward the glass office near the mailboxes. Inside, a woman named Marlene sat behind a desk stacked with binders. She had reading glasses on a chain and the calm expression of someone who's handled every version of human mess. I placed the form down gently. "This was submitted," I said, "but I didn't sign it." Marlene adjusted her glasses and studied it. "We received it last Friday." "From who?" I asked. She hesitated, then said carefully, "It was dropped off at the front desk." I didn't need a name. The air between Marlene and me carried the obvious. "I want a copy of the bylaws," I said. "The sections about guests and occupancy." Marlene nodded, businesslike now. "Of course. We can print the relevant pages. Also, Ms. Whitaker, the building has security cameras in the lobby and elevators. If you believe there's been forgery, you may want documentation." I felt my throat tighten, not from fear, but from gratitude that someone was speaking the language of facts. "Yes," I said, "I would." She printed the bylaws and highlighted a paragraph about unauthorized residence and misrepresentation. She stamped the pages with the association's name. The sound of that stamp was small, but it made something in me sit up straighter. Upstairs, Susan was on the couch when I returned, legs tucked under her like a teenager. She glanced at the papers in my hand and narrowed her eyes. "What's that?" "Information," I said. She scoffed. "You're seriously doing this?" I didn't answer. I went into my bedroom and placed the documents in a folder with the bills and the bank notice. I added the resident update form. Then I opened my notebook, the one I used for grocery lists and Frank's old reminders, and began writing dates, times, what was said, what was done. Did you ever realize too late that you were being used, not with cruelty but with comfort, like a slow theft disguised as family? That night, the lake wind was loud. I sat by the window with my tea and watched the lights ripple on the water. In the reflection of the glass, I could see the living room behind me, Susan's silhouette moving, Darren's shoulders hunched over his screen. They looked settled, like roots, but roots can be lifted if you loosen the soil. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I didn't beg. I simply kept my papers together, my accounts secured, and my spine a little straighter. And in the quiet, I began to understand the difference between being a mother and being a doormat. The day I stopped cooking dinner felt bigger than it should have. I stood in the kitchen at 5:30, the clock above the stove blinking, because Darren had unplugged it to charge something, and realized I didn't know what to make anymore. The fridge was full, but none of it felt like mine. Susan bought things I never touched: flavored waters, pre-cut fruit in plastic tubs, expensive sauces with names I couldn't pronounce. My usual ingredients were pushed to the back like they'd expired. So I closed the refrigerator door and sat down. When Susan came in an hour later and asked, "What's for dinner?" I looked up from my book and said, "I already ate." She stared at me like I'd broken a rule she never bothered to explain. "You didn't make anything?" "No," I said simply. The silence that followed was sharp. Darren opened a delivery app on his phone without a word. It was the first time I saw irritation flicker across Susan's face without being directed at me out loud. Small changes followed after that. I stopped doing their laundry. I moved my groceries to a plastic bin in my bedroom. I labeled it with a piece of masking tape that said EW in my own careful handwriting, and the sight of my initials gave me an unexpected sense of ownership. I adjusted my schedule so I left early for walks along the lake, just to breathe air that hadn't been claimed. Susan noticed. "You're being passive-aggressive," she said one afternoon, blocking the hallway while I tried to pass. "If you have something to say, just say it." I met her eyes. "I am." "What are you saying?" "That I'm tired." She laughed, but it was brittle. "Of what? You don't even work anymore." The words landed hard enough that I had to grip the doorframe. "I worked for 40 years, I said, "and I'm still paying for this place. That doesn't stop because I retired." She waved a hand. "You know what I mean." I did know what she meant. I'd known for a while. In her version of reality, my usefulness had an expiration date. That evening, after they went out, I took out the folder again. I spread everything across my bed: bank notices, bills, the bylaws, the forged resident form. I added something new: a printed copy of my condo deed. My name alone. No beneficiaries. No shared ownership. It felt heavy and reassuring in my hands, like proof that I still existed on paper, even if my voice had been softened in my own home. I called my friend Ruth that night. Ruth and I worked together for 20 years. She knows how to listen without fixing. When she answered, I didn't even say hello properly. I just said, "I think my daughter is trying to take over my life." Ruth didn't gasp or rush me. She said, "Tell me everything." So I did. I talked until my tea went cold. I talked about the key, the bills, the bank, the way Susan spoke about me like I was already fading. When I finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Edith," she said gently, using my full name like an anchor, "you need legal advice. Not because she's evil, because she's entitled." The words sat with me long after we hung up. 2 days later, I made an appointment with an attorney whose name I found through the senior services office. His office smelled like old books and lemon candy. A framed photograph of a much younger him shook hands with someone I didn't recognize. He introduced himself as Mr. Halpern and spoke slowly, not because he thought I was slow, but because he understood weight. I laid my folder on his desk. He read everything without interrupting. When he finished, he leaned back and folded his hands. "You've done the right thing by documenting," he said. "Nothing you've described is legal grounds for her to take your property, but there are warning signs." "Such as?" I asked. "Unauthorized changes to accounts, misrepresentation to the condo association, establishing residency without consent. These are often early steps." The room felt very still. "Early steps to what?" "Control," he said, "sometimes framed as protection." I swallowed. "What do I do?" "You reclaim authority," he said calmly. "Formally. That means written notice, boundaries, and third-party awareness. You do not argue, you inform." He drafted a letter while I watched, the click of his keyboard steady and confident. It stated that Susan and Darren were temporary guests, that no residency had been granted, and that all financial matters remained solely under my control. It referenced condo bylaws and state tenancy laws. It was factual, almost cold. When he slid it across the desk, my name typed at the bottom, I felt something loosen in my chest. "Have it delivered in a way that can be documented," he said, "and notify the property manager." I walked home slowly, the letter in my bag, the lake air sharp against my face. Upstairs, Susan was on the couch again, feet up, television loud. She barely looked at me. I didn't say anything that night. Instead, the next morning, I went to the front desk and asked Javier to witness the delivery of a document. He nodded without questions and noted the time. Marlene was copied by email. Back upstairs, I placed the envelope on the coffee table between Susan and Darren. Susan picked it up, frowning. "What's this?" "Information," I said again. She opened it, read the first lines, and her face changed, not to anger, but to disbelief. "You can't be serious." "I am," I said. Darren finally looked up, eyes narrowing as he scanned the page over her shoulder. "This is unnecessary," he said. "We're family." "I know," I replied. "That's why I'm being clear." Susan stood abruptly. "You're choosing paper over people." I looked at her, really looked, at the woman she'd become, at the daughter I still loved, and at the stranger who thought my silence was consent. "No," I said quietly. "I'm choosing myself." She stormed into the bedroom that used to be mine, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the picture frames. Darren followed, muttering. I sat down in my chair by the window, hands folded, heart pounding but steady. For the first time in months, the tension in my shoulders eased, because whatever came next, it would not be hidden, and it would not be on my knees. The apartment felt colder after the letter, even though the heat clicked on like always. Susan didn't speak to me for 2 full days. Not a word. She moved through the condo like a ghost with purpose, opening cabinets harder than necessary, closing doors without care. Darren avoided me entirely, his politeness evaporating into tight silence. I took note of everything, not with spite, but with attention. Silence has a shape when you stop pretending it doesn't. On the 3rd morning, Susan broke it. "You embarrassed me," she said, standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed. "You went to the building. You involved other people." "I involved the people responsible for this property," I replied, spreading cream cheese on my toast. My hand didn't shake. I was proud of that. "You made it sound like we were criminals." "I described what was happening," I said. "If that felt uncomfortable, maybe it's because it was." Her mouth opened, then closed. She wasn't used to resistance that didn't raise its voice. Later that day, I noticed something missing, the small wooden box from my dresser drawer, the one Frank gave me on our 10th anniversary. It held old bank statements, my social security card, the original copy of our marriage license. I hadn't opened it in years, but I knew exactly where it belonged. I searched calmly, drawer by drawer, closet, hall cabinet. When I reached the master bedroom doorway, the room that still smelled faintly of my lavender sachets, I stopped. Susan was sitting on the bed with the box open beside her. "What are you doing?" I asked. She jumped slightly, then recovered fast. "Relax. I was just organizing. You keep important things in weird places." "That's my box," I said. She shrugged. "I figured it should be somewhere safe." I stepped forward and closed the box with care. "It was safe." She rolled her eyes. "You're acting paranoid." "No," I said. "I'm acting aware." I took the box back to my room and placed it in the bottom of my closet. Then I did something I'd been avoiding for weeks. I went online and requested a credit report. The results came back that evening. There had been an inquiry, a soft one, but recent. Susan's email address was listed as a contact on a pre-qualification form for a personal loan. No loan had been approved, but the attempt alone made my chest ache with a dull, steady pressure. I printed everything. The next morning, I called the Social Security office and placed an additional fraud alert on my file. I followed that with my bank, my credit card company, and the utility providers. Each call took time. Each representative asked questions. Each confirmation number went into my notebook. The act of writing them down felt grounding, like stitching a tear before it widened. Susan watched me from the doorway during one call, her face tight. "You don't trust me anymore," she said when I hung up. Trust. Such a fragile word, thrown around like it doesn't require care. "I trust actions," I said, "and I trust records." That night, she cried loudly in the bedroom. Darren comforted her with murmured reassurances that carried through the thin walls. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my hands folded over my stomach, listening without intervening. There was a time I would have gone to her, wrapped her in my arms, apologized just to make the sound stop. That time had passed. The following week, Marlene from the Condo Association called me into her office. Her tone was professional, but there was a crease between her brows that hadn't been there before. "We've received a complaint," she said, "about occupancy." I nodded. "I expected that." She slid a paper across the desk. It was a written statement from Susan claiming long-term residence and verbal permission. My name was mentioned several times. My consent assumed. "I'd like to respond in writing," I said. "Of course," Marlene replied. I handed her copies of the letter from Mr. Halpern, the deed, and the documentation of unauthorized submissions. She read slowly, carefully, then placed them in a folder marked with my unit number. "Thank you for being thorough," she said. "We'll handle this appropriately." As I left the office, I felt the strangest thing. Not victory, not relief, but steadiness, like my feet were finally on solid ground. That evening, Susan confronted me again, her voice sharp with panic now. "They're saying we're not allowed to stay long-term," she said. "They're talking about fines." "I know," I said. "You did this." "I clarified," I corrected. She looked at me like she didn't recognize me. Maybe she didn't. Maybe neither of us did anymore. "You'd really throw us out?" she asked. I met her gaze. "I'd rather see you stand on your own than shrink me to make it easier." Darren packed quietly that night. No apology, no goodbye. Susan lingered, standing in the doorway of what had once been my bedroom, her face pale and unsure. "I didn't think you'd push back," she said. "I didn't think I'd need to," I replied. When the door finally closed behind them, the condo exhaled. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was clean. I sat at the kitchen table and moved my papers into a new folder. On the front, I wrote one word, mine. And for the first time since Frank died, I felt like the space around me belonged to the woman still living inside these walls. The quiet didn't last the way I thought it would. 2 mornings after Susan and Darren left, I found a note taped to my door when I returned from the lake. It wasn't handwritten, it was printed, folded with care, like something prepared in advance. It said Susan needed to retrieve personal belongings and would return later that week. No apology, no time, just expectation. I peeled it off slowly and set it on the entry table beside my keys. The paper felt heavier than it should have. That afternoon, my phone rang. Susan's name lit up the screen, bright and familiar, and for a moment my thumb hovered over the decline button. Then I answered. "You didn't have to escalate things," she said immediately. Her voice was controlled now, measured. "We could have handled this privately." "I tried," I said, "for months." "You blindsided us," she insisted. You involved lawyers, the building. You made me look unstable. I sat down, the chair creaking under me. Susan, you tried to change my bank access. Silence stretched long enough that I could hear her breathing. I was helping, she said finally. By taking control, I replied. She sighed, sharp and frustrated. You're overreacting. That word again, dressed differently. Come get your things, I said. But not alone and not without notice. She scoffed. What does that mean? It means I'll be present, I said, and so will building security. Her tone shifted then, irritation giving way to something colder. You don't trust me at all. I trust the process, I said, and ended the call. The next step wasn't dramatic, but it was necessary. I went to the local police station, not to file charges, but to document concerns. The officer at the front desk was young, polite, and careful with his words. I explained the unauthorized account access, the forged form, the removal of personal documents. He listened without interrupting, typing as I spoke. You're not filing a criminal complaint at this time? He asked. No, I said. I just want a record. He nodded. That's wise. Wise. I hadn't been called that in a while. He printed a report summary and handed me a copy. The paper felt official, solid. Another layer of protection built not with anger, but with foresight. When Susan returned 2 days later, she brought a friend with her. I recognized the tactic immediately. Witnesses change behavior. Javier stood nearby, arms folded, neutral and steady. Susan avoided my eyes as she gathered boxes from the bedroom. She moved fast, like someone afraid of hesitating too long. When she reached for the nightstand, her hand paused. You kept his watch, she said quietly. Yes, I replied. She nodded once, as if conceding something she'd never admitted wanting. At the door, she turned back. You didn't have to make it so formal. I did, I said, because informal was costing me myself. She left without another word. That night, alone again, I sat at the table and reviewed everything I'd collected. Papers, dates, notes, proof not just of what happened, but of who I had become in response. I realized something then that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore. Have you ever reached a moment where anger burns itself out, leaving only clarity behind? In the days that followed, I made changes that had nothing to do with Susan. I updated my will. I assigned a neutral executor. I added a clause about residency and property use that was clear and unambiguous. Mr. Halpern reviewed it and nodded approvingly. You're thinking ahead, he said. I'm thinking clearly, I replied. I changed the locks back to standard keys and returned the smart lock. I reset my routines, morning walks, afternoon calls with Ruth, volunteering twice a week at the library where my name was printed on a badge and my time was respected. The condo felt like it remembered me. One evening, as the sun dropped low over the lake, my phone buzzed with a message from Susan. Just one line. I didn't know you felt that way. I stared at it for a long time before responding. I didn't either, I typed back. And that was the truth. I turned the phone face down and stepped onto the balcony. The air was cool, honest. The water moved the way it always had, indifferent to conflict, steady in its own boundaries. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had to brace myself for what might come next. I had already done the hardest part. I had chosen not to disappear. Peace, I learned, does not arrive all at once. It comes in increments like payments on a debt you didn't realize you were owed. The first increment was the mail. For weeks, envelopes had arrived addressed to Susan at my unit number. Credit card offers, promotional letters. One afternoon, there was a thick envelope from a collections agency, not in my name, hers. I stood at the counter, turning it over in my hands, feeling the weight of a truth I'd only half seen before. Susan hadn't been looking for comfort. She'd been looking for cover. I wrote, "Not at this address," on the front, neat and clear, and handed it back to Javier at the desk. He raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The envelope disappeared into the outgoing bin, and with it, a quiet piece of responsibility that was never mine to carry. The second increment came through my phone. Susan started calling again, not often, but enough to keep a thread taut between us. Her voice was different now, less certain. She talked about staying with friends, about plans that sounded temporary, even to her own ears. I listened without interrupting. I didn't offer solutions. I didn't reach for my wallet. When the calls ended, I felt tired but not hollow. I noticed how much energy I'd spent for years anticipating her needs before she voiced them. Now that I wasn't doing that, my days felt longer, fuller, quieter. The third increment was social. At the library, a woman named Carol asked if I wanted to join her and two others for coffee after our shift. I almost said no out of habit, then caught myself and said yes instead. We sat by the window of a small cafe, sunlight catching on chipped mugs, and talked about nothing urgent. Books, weather, grandchildren. When I laughed, it surprised me how natural it felt, like a muscle remembering its purpose. At home, I rearranged furniture. Not dramatically, just enough to remind myself that space responds when you treat it like it's yours. I moved Frank's chair closer to the window. I cleared the second bedroom and brought my sewing table back where it belonged. I opened the curtains wide and let the light decide what stayed. One afternoon, Ruth came over with lemon bars and sat across from me at the table, surveying the room. "You look different," she said. "I feel quieter," I replied. She nodded. That's usually how strength shows up. Not long after, Marlene from the association called to confirm the matter was closed. No fines, no violations. She thanked me for my cooperation and said, "You handled this with grace." I thought about that word after we hung up. Grace. I'd always associated it with patience, with letting things go. But maybe grace also meant knowing when to stop giving something away. The last increment came without warning. I found one of Susan's old notebooks while cleaning the hall closet. It must have been left behind in the shuffle. Inside were scattered thoughts, half plans, numbers scribbled without context. On the last page, written smaller than the rest, was a line that made me sit down. I don't know how to do this on my own. I closed the notebook and held it for a long time. Not with anger, not even with sadness, with understanding. That night, I placed it in an envelope and mailed it to her with no note. Just the book, just the truth she'd already written for herself. As weeks passed, the condo stopped feeling like a place I'd defended and started feeling like a place I inhabited again. I slept better. I cooked meals meant only for me. I paid my bills on time and watched my accounts with the calm attentiveness of someone who knows the value of what they've protected. Susan called less. When she did, she sounded steadier. I heard it in the pauses, in the way she didn't rush to fill silence anymore. We weren't healed. Not yet. But we were honest, and honesty, I found, makes room for things that can't grow in the dark. The letter arrived on a Thursday, folded into thirds, my name written carefully across the front in Susan's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. There was a time when I could tell her mood just by how she shaped her letters. This one was deliberate, slower than usual. I didn't open it right away. I made tea first. I sat by the window and watched a cargo ship slide across the lake, steady and patient, carrying something heavy without complaint. Only then did I open the envelope. She didn't apologize. Not directly. Susan never was good at that. Instead, she wrote about being tired, about feeling like she was always one mistake away from falling through the floor. She wrote about Kevin, the divorce I'd learned about only through fragments, and how she'd never quite landed on her feet afterward. She said she thought moving in with me would reset things. She said she hadn't realized how much she'd crossed a line until it was already behind her. The sentence that stayed with me was simple. I didn't think you would say no. I folded the letter back into its envelope and placed it in the drawer beside Frank's watch. Some things don't need an answer right away. That afternoon, I met with Mr. Halpern one last time. Not because there was a crisis, but because I wanted to close the loop properly. He reviewed the final updates to my documents and handed them back with a satisfied nod. "You've reduced your exposure significantly," he said. "Financially and legally." "And emotionally?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "That part doesn't come with forms." Outside his office, the city sounded louder than usual. Traffic, voices, life continuing at a pace that didn't wait for family drama to resolve itself. I walked home instead of taking the bus, letting the movement clear my head. Over the next few weeks, Susan and I settled into a new rhythm. Careful, polite, sometimes warm, sometimes strained. She came by once with notice to pick up the last box she'd forgotten. We sat at the kitchen table afterward, hands wrapped around mugs, talking about neutral things. Weather, a movie she'd seen, a recipe I'd tried. She glanced around the condo and said quietly, "It looks like you again." "I feel like me again," I replied. She nodded, eyes down. There was regret there, but also something else. Respect, maybe, or the beginning of it. After she left, I realized I wasn't shaken. I wasn't bracing for the next request or the next disappointment. I simply cleaned the mugs and went on with my day. That felt like progress. The building itself seemed to mirror my steadiness. Familiar faces lingered longer in conversation. Mrs. Delaney invited me in for tea one afternoon and told me stories about her late husband that she'd apparently been saving. Javier started asking about my walks, genuinely interested. Small connections, but real. One morning, I found a flyer in my mailbox about a community writing group that met once a week in the common room. I almost threw it out. Then I remembered how many years I'd spent listening and how few I'd spent telling my own stories. I went. The room smelled like coffee and dry erase markers. There were 6 of us, all ages, all carrying notebooks like shields. When it was my turn to read, my voice trembled at first. Then it settled. I spoke about loss, about motherhood, about what happens when love and obligation get tangled. Afterward, a young woman across the table said, "That sounded true." It was the best compliment I'd received in years. Susan called me that night. Not in crisis. Not with urgency, just to tell me she'd started a new job, temporary but promising. "I'm proud of you," I said, and meant it without reservation. There was a pause on the line. "That means more than you know," she said. We were learning each other again, from a distance that didn't hurt. One evening, as I sorted through old photos, I found one of Frank and Susan on the beach, her small hand wrapped around his finger, both of them laughing into the sun. I sat with it for a long time. Love had always been there. It hadn't disappeared. It had just been misused, bent under the weight of fear. I placed the photo back in its album and closed it gently. Later, standing on the balcony, I realized something that surprised me. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt complete. Not because I'd won anything, but because I'd stopped losing myself to keep others comfortable. The lake stretched out before me, wide and unconcerned, and for the first time in a long while, I felt aligned with its calm. Susan's story wasn't over, neither was mine. But now, they were separate enough to breathe. Susan showed up on a Saturday morning with a paper bag of bagels and a caution in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Not the caution of someone plotting, but the kind you wear when you're stepping into a room where you've broken something once and don't want to hear it crack again. I called first, she said at the door, holding up her phone like proof. You did, I replied, and stepped aside. She stayed near the entryway at first, as if the condo might reject her. The air smelled like toasted sesame and winter coats drying. I took the bagels to the kitchen and set them on a plate, feeling the old instinct to host rise up in me. I didn't fight it. I just kept it honest. We sat at the table in the late morning light. She told me about her new job, an office coordinator position for a small medical supply company. Nothing glamorous, but steady. She talked about filing paperwork, tracking inventory, learning the names of people who liked their coffee black. I listened, noticing how her shoulders settled as she spoke, like routine was finally giving her something to lean on. I'm renting a room, she said, quieter now. It's not great, but it's mine. That matters, I said. She nodded and stared at her hands, turning her ring finger absent-mindedly. No ring anymore, just the habit. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. She placed it on the table, pushing it toward me with 2 fingers, as if it might bite. It's not much, she said, but I wanted to start paying you back. I didn't open it right away. I just looked at her face. She had always been good at asking. She'd never been good at offering. This was new terrain for both of us. I appreciate the gesture, I said carefully. It's real, she insisted, a flash of defensiveness. There's a money order inside. I went to the post office. The mention of the post office made it feel strangely sincere. A money order takes effort. It requires standing in line. It requires admitting you don't have the kind of account that makes things easy. I slid the envelope toward me and opened it. A money order, made out to Edith Whitaker for $200. There was also a folded receipt from the counter, the kind with a timestamp and the clerk's initials. I didn't cry. I didn't smile too wide. I simply nodded. Thank you, I said. That's a start. Susan exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for weeks. We ate bagels slowly. She looked around the kitchen like she was seeing it properly for the first time. My labeled jars, the bills neatly filed, the absence of clutter, the calm. You changed, she said. I remembered who I was, I replied. She flinched slightly at that, like it stung, but she didn't argue. Instead, she reached for her coffee and took a sip, letting the silence sit between us without trying to decorate it. After she left, I walked down to the lobby with the money order in my coat pocket. Javier held the door, as always, and gave me a small look that asked without asking. She's doing better, I said. He nodded once. Good. At the bank, I deposited the money order in person, not because I couldn't do it another way, but because I wanted the trail. The teller stamped the receipt and handed it back. I put it in my folder when I got home, right behind the bills and the report summary from the police station. Not as a weapon, as a record of change. That afternoon, Marlene called. Ms. Whitaker, she said, we received a request to add a resident to your unit again. The words tightened something in my chest, but not with panic, with alertness. I did not request that, I said evenly. I'm the sole owner. I'd like a copy of the submission. Of course, she replied. It was an online form. The email used wasn't yours. I didn't need to guess. I could already feel Susan's earlier composure, the money order, the careful visit. Had she tried to do something behind it? Or had someone else, Darren maybe, still been pulling strings? Marlene, I said, please keep my file flagged. No changes without my in-person confirmation. It already is, she assured me, and we can provide the IP information to law enforcement if needed. Thank you, I said, and meant it. When I hung up, I sat at the table and held my hands still. This was the part people don't talk about after you set boundaries. The aftershocks, the testing, the way some people try the door again just to see if it's really locked. I called Susan. She answered on the second ring, voice bright at first. "Hi, Mom." "Marlene called," I said gently. "Someone tried to add a resident to my unit online again." There was a pause that felt like the moment before a glass slips off the counter. "What?" she said, and this time it sounded real. "No, that wasn't me." "I'm not accusing," I replied. "I'm informing. Because it's important you understand this can't happen again. Not by you, not by anyone connected to you." She took a breath. I heard street noise in the background, the thin sound of buses and winter wind. "I'll tell Darren to stop whatever he's doing," she said, and the bitterness in her voice was new. I didn't even know he still had access to anything. "Good," I said. "And Susan?" "What?" "If you ever need help, you ask me plainly. You don't reach around me." Another pause, softer this time. "Okay," she said. "Okay, I hear you." When the call ended, I didn't feel shaken. I felt resolved. The difference mattered. That evening, I went to the writing group again. Carol saved me a seat. Someone brought store-bought cookies and apologized for not having time to bake. We laughed. I read a page about Frank, about his hands, the way they looked after a day of work, the way they used to cut my face like I was something worth protecting. When I finished, the room was quiet in a respectful way, not pitying, just present. Walking home afterward, the city lights reflected off the wet sidewalk like scattered coins. I realized how many moments I'd missed while trying to keep Susan afloat, how many evenings I'd spent worrying instead of living. The thought didn't make me angry. It made me careful with what I had left. Back in my condo, I locked the door, checked the chain, and leaned my forehead against the wood for a second, grateful for the simple certainty of it. The lake wind pressed against the windows, steady and honest. And inside, everything was quiet in the best way, like a home that finally knew who it belonged to. The morning light comes in softer these days. I wake before the alarm, make my tea, and sit by the window while the lake decides what kind of day it wants to be. Some mornings, it's restless. Some mornings, it's smooth as glass. I've learned not to rush it, or myself. Susan and I speak now like two adults who have accepted the shape of each other. Not every day, not with expectations. Sometimes she sends a photo of her lunch. Sometimes I tell her about a book I'm reading. There is space between us, but it's the healthy kind, the kind that lets you breathe. I didn't win anything in the way movies like to show. No dramatic apology, no moment where everyone suddenly understands. What I gained was quieter than that. I gained mornings without dread. I gained evenings that belonged to me. I gained the sound of my own thoughts without interruption. Have you ever noticed how freedom doesn't announce itself? It settles in gently like a habit you forgot you deserved. I still miss Frank. That never goes away. But I talk to him differently now. I tell him I finally learned what he always knew, that love doesn't mean shrinking yourself to be needed. It means standing upright and letting others decide how to meet you there. My condo feels like home again, not because it's quiet, but because it's honest. Every bill is mine. Every choice is mine. And every boundary I keep is an act of care, not punishment. If there's one thing I'd pass on, it's this. Being kind does not require being invisible. You can be warm and still be firm. You can love deeply and still say no. Thank you for sitting with my story, for giving it your time and your attention. If it touched something in you, I'd be grateful if you showed your support with a like and a subscription and shared your thoughts in the comments. And tell me, if you were in my place, what would you have done?